Good morning, Professor Reid.
Good morning.
Hope you're well.
Thank you.
Just before we start, just want to thank Also Good for having us and lending us this space. It's a dessert place on York Street downtown. Try it out if you haven't. Really good cakes. I'm really excited to talk to you, Professor Reid. Little introduction before we start. You're a professor at University of Ottawa, philosophy. Your research focuses on Hegel, German idealism. You're a member of the Hegel Society of America, the Canadian Philosophical Association, and the Canadian Society for Continental Philosophy.
Right.
You've studied in France, Paris, and you did your master's over there, I believe.
Yeah, I did everything there. I went there after high school from Toronto. I'm from Toronto originally, and I went there and because I heard that they had some pretty heavy-duty philosophy at the Sorbonne, so I thought that was a good place to go. And to my amazement, I could actually understand what was going on. I mean, my high school French had actually taught me enough that I could understand what the professors were saying.
That's a hard thing. I think the AC went on. That's a hard thing to do, I believe, even in philosophy, because it's such a language-focused study, right?
Absolutely.
When you read and stuff like that. So today, I wanted to ask you questions about mainly your upcoming book, Hegel's Grammatical Ontology, Vanishing Words, and Hermeneutical, Openness in the Phenomenology of Spirit.
Right.
Which is a super interesting theme, and I looked up your other books. There are quite a few of them, and you kind of like it's really wide. You're not really conscious just one question, but really a wide range of different questions on Hegel.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really enjoy about Hegel, is he's one of those philosophers, like Aristotle, maybe Plato, Kant, one of those philosophers who touches on virtually everything. So if you're interested in music, you can look at Hegel's philosophy of music. If you're interested in biology, you can look at his philosophy of biology. So his philosophy lends itself to like very wide range of interests. The political philosophy is obviously very well known, but perhaps more known than some of the other areas. But so there's an opportunity to explore many, many interests. Otherwise, I would have been bored. I've been, I've been teaching at the university for 20 years. I've been, let's say, another 20 before that, doing my university and PhD. And so I've really been thinking about Hegel and writing about Hegel for at least 30 years.
That's amazing.
So there must be something there, that allows one to still find new things. And partly because Hegel, if you've had the opportunity to read him, he's not the easiest philosopher, and that was one of the things that attracted me to him, was that he was very difficult, challenging. And to me, it was kind of like climbing a mountain. I was just going to keep at it until I got something out of it, because I had the impression there's something important going on here, and I want to understand what it is. And, I still struggle with Hegel texts. There are some that I read and I say, what is he talking about? It's not easy. And
I'm a bit curious about your first encounter with Hegel. How did you hear about him?
Yeah, well, when I began studying philosophy, again at the Sorbonne, l'Université de Paris 4, it seemed that all the professors were mentioning Hegel. They would, even if they were teaching a course on Descartes or Spinoza or Aristotle or anybody, there was always some reference to this Hegel guy, and I thought, well, there must be something there for all these. And so I was kind of trying to piece together little bits and pieces. Okay, this professor says this about Hegel. Okay, I'll take that. Somebody else says something else about Hegel. And so I was trying to sort of patch it together, and finally I don't think I ever had one actual course entirely devoted to Hegel until I got into my graduate years. He'd be there, little bits, and okay, we're going to look at the master-slave dialectic and the phenomenology, or we're going to look at this little piece. And so I guess I really wanted to piece it together. But that's how I encountered him, through references that professors were making to him.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to keep it on path. But
okay.
So if say like in a 5-minute or a 2-minute, who's Hegel? Like
right.
His context and to people who are listening
Sure.
might not be familiar with him.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's kind of like the elevator pitch for Hegel. It's terrifying, and it's taken me about 20 years to be able to maybe do that. I think if you want to look at, I think every great philosopher has some kind of fundamental intuition or some fundamental insight. And with Hegel, it is what I would call the agency of thought. Okay. The idea that thought is not just some kind of processing mechanism in our heads, but you have to get used to the idea that thought has agency. It actually comes out of our heads into the world. It posits itself in the world. And so that's kind of the fundamental intuition. It means that the world appears to us immediately, in an unreflected way. And we cannot help but think what presents itself to us as objectivity. And so we have to think of that thinking as actually coming out of ourselves into objectivity and transforming that objectivity in different ways, determining it, transforming it, making it into something for us, right? Like this microphone would not be the same thing for my 11-year-old son as it is for me. It represents something different. My thought comes out of my head, it's a way of thinking it, into that object and says, oh, it's a microphone, it's on, there's a red. You know what I mean? So I think that's the fundamental intuition. So it's idealism. Hegel is usually associated with, well, he's called sort of the idealist philosopher. But that doesn't mean that everything is idea. It means that we, as subjects, we have ideality in our minds, in ourselves, that comes out of ourselves and determines the world in a way that makes it for us. So I think that, if I had to say in 5 minutes, that's what. So that means that that's very different from, for example, a kind of romantic view of the world, which would look at nature as having agency. That nature itself is expressive, that nature is something that has activity and agency within itself. Whereas for Hegel, that you have to think of that agency as taking place in our minds and coming out of our minds into nature and making nature somehow in our image for us. And because hearing you talk, I think a lot about Kant. That seemed, from what I understood for studying it like once, there seems for Kant to be a world, and then we have our capacities that in the world, we kind of receive the world, and it kind of filters down to what we're able to understand and how we're able to understand it. But from what I understand, Hegel is more we impose our way of thinking to the world. Yes, yeah, that's right. It's a good way to look at it. I think Kant, generally, we could say he's known as a transcendental idealist. What does that mean? It means that it's within our minds that we have forms of sensibility. We have concepts that allow us to process reality. So, although there is a spontaneity of thought in Kant, we can say that the model is essentially passive as far as subjectivity and mind goes. That also means that for Kant, we can't really know anything beyond our own ideas, our concepts that we create with our mind. We can't really know objectivity or the things in themselves, because all we know is what we experience through our senses. Is there something behind them? Is there a thing in itself behind the sensations that I receive? I can't really say anything about that in a scientific way. Hegel and the other German idealists like Schelling find that barrier deeply problematic. The idea that knowledge has to stop at the door of objectivity is just unacceptable. Because for Hegel, knowledge, cognition, whatever you want to call it, actually exists. We know things. That's just a fact. And how do we know things? What is our consciousness? Our consciousness is always consciousness of something that is objective. So objectivity is always there from the beginning. If there is consciousness, then there is objectivity. So now we have to look at how different forms of thought determine different forms of objectivity. What is the dynamic relationship between subjectivity and objectivity? But you're right about Kant, because with Kant there's the idea that the limits to my theoretical knowledge, because I cannot know beyond my sensation, those very limits are what allows me the freedom of moral philosophy that's implied in moral philosophy. Because I am not, there's just part of me that, called reason, that is beyond kind of the work of the data processing of my mind. That means that there's a possibility for my reason to be free of natural determination. So, Kant's great. I'm not a philosopher who thinks, oh, yeah, great, now Hegel, we can kind of forget about Kant. I think I was saying this to my graduate seminar the other day. It's not like you have to know Kant in order to read Hegel, because, as I said, there's already so few people who read Hegel. If I told them that they had to understand Kant first, that would reduce them to, like 2 people. So, so I think it helps open up Hegel if you understand something about Kant, and it helps open up Kant if you understand something about Descartes. So you can tell, and this is my French background in philosophy, it's very historical. I believe that the history of philosophy is philosophy, and that philosophy can best be practiced in a way that looks at the historical figures in philosophy. And that may seem, you study the Dominican College University, and I think that's the approach there. But if you went to most of the universities in the United States, for example, you would find philosophy departments that don't really teach history of philosophy, except perhaps in ancient Greek or maybe a medieval specialist. But they even read Hegel in a very contemporary analytic light, rather than looking at him in reference to Kant, which you mentioned, but I think it's very important.
And it's what you just said is in my opinion, a very Hegelian way to see it, to see philosophy. This dialectic between different dialogues, the dialogue between different philosophers or ideas. I wanted to, just before introducing your book, talk a bit about the Phenomenology of the Spirit, which is a monumental book and
Casse-tête.
Yes, exactly. So I don't know if you could a bit give the general. I just realized that it was about consciousness not long ago, and I haven't read it completely. I've started reading, and it's really, really hard. And I started reading the Hegel of Charles Taylor, which is more accessible, but it's still pretty hard. So I don't know if you could give us a bit of a general overall view. Sure.
5 minutes. What the phenomenology is about? Sure. It is about consciousness, and it's about stages of consciousness. It's kind of ambiguous. So I'm not going to go into all the ambiguity of how the phenomenology stands with regards to the entire system, but Hegel does call it a ladder up up to his system. He does call it an apprenticeship before one is able to really enter into the system per se. And so it really is an apprenticeship where we look at different forms of consciousness almost as forms, almost in a pedagogical way, where these different forms of consciousness progress from an initial state, which he calls natural consciousness, which is kind of childlike. It's a kind of consciousness that says, I am who I am, and the world is what it is. The world is what is not me, and I am me. So we start off there. And from there, we develop different, richer forms of consciousness. And when I say richer forms of consciousness, I mean forms where the subject, the self, is able to recognize itself progressively in the object. The whole point is self-knowledge for Hegel, and in the Phenomenology and in philosophy generally. Socrates said it, know thyself. And in a way, the Phenomenology is an expression of that, where to know yourself, you have to know yourself, not just in yourself, but in otherness. You have to be able to recognize yourself in the other. So those forms of consciousness enrich or progress in a way that the self or the subject progressively recognizes itself in objectivity to the extent where it can be, as Hegel says, at home in otherness. So it's really overcoming this fundamental naive divide that the self is what it is and the object is what is not me. And I have to see that the object is always an object for me and that I am always a me in relation to the object that I find in front of me. So consciousness is just that relation between subjectivity and objectivity, between mind and object, between mind and matter, and how those can become increasingly interrelated throughout the progression of the phenomenology. So I think in a nutshell we could say it's that.
It's a hard thing to do, to try to explain what it is, but it's the way that I got to Hegel was through Axel Honneth, the German philosopher, and while studying Honneth, we studied I don't remember his name, but I think Herbert or something like that.
Marcuse? No.
No. He was a sociologist.
Oh, okay.
He talked about that, and he mentioned, I believe, Hegel saying that we're always determined by the other. We can never be understood by ourselves. That's right. And Honneth, for example, is a thinker of, like Charles Taylor, a thinker of multiculturalism, I suppose, but also just that idea of mutual recognition, which is fundamental in Hegel. In chapter 4, we have this great dialectic of intersubjectivity, where in order to be a free subject, I realize that I have to recognize your status as a free subject as well, and reciprocally. So there's this mutual recognition that is picked up by Honneth and Charles Taylor as very fundamental. It's a fundamental insight, I think, that you find in Hegel. I think that's one of the most important. I would love that everyone would understand or think about that.
Yeah. And the other thing too that makes me, just while I remember it, is that idea of finding yourself in others and having others, recognizing that others are not completely other, that they are also involved in your own selfhood. It's an example that I use in class sometimes, that, naively, I would say, I am a man because I'm not a woman, for example. That would be sort of an initial natural consciousness way of looking at things. I am what I am because I'm not something else. I'm a man because I'm not a woman. And what Hegel asks us to do is to say that the very fact that I'm determining or defining myself in terms of what I'm not, i.e., in terms of womanhood, means that I'm actually incorporating womanhood into the definition of who I am. Mm-hmm. So it's a very, I think, sort of a thought that incorporates difference, where what is unity is always undermined by difference. And I think that is a very important aspect of Hegel that I think is important today. When we can look at, rather than looking at things in sort of a hard unitary way, we're able to sort of look at them. And that's the substance of dialectic as well that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Okay, so let's dive a bit into your book, Hegel's Grammatical Ontology, Vanishing Words and Hermeneutical, Openness and the Phenomenology of Spirit, at Bloomsbury.
Yeah.
So first, where can people find that book?
The best way to get it is at a library, because otherwise it's incredibly expensive. I shouldn't be saying that. I guess I should be promoting it and saying, go on Amazon and buy it. But let's be honest here. It's like $150 or something. So great if you've got $150 and you say I really want to spend it on Reid's book. Go ahead and do it. But other than that, you can get it through university libraries.
Okay.
And so what's it about? It's first of all, I've been interested in Hegel and language for as long as I've been interested in Hegel, because I was talking about the agency of thought and how thought comes out of our heads into the world. Well, that's pretty abstract, but a real way we can look at how that happens is through language. Language, for Hegel, is sort of the embodiment, the concrete embodiment of thought. Thought, for Hegel, just is emptiness unless it is expressed in a linguistic form. So I've always been interested in that, and I've always been interested in the phenomenology of spirit. And I guess my, again, for the last 10 years, I've been reading the phenomenology of spirit in a linguistic way. I've been trying to find forms of language that correspond to the forms of consciousness. And reading other people's articles, works, and everything, 10 years. Finally, I got a 6-month sabbatical. I went to southern Spain, and I just said, I'm going to write it. I've had it. I can't think about this anymore. And so, I just let it happen, and it really, the 10 years of background really helped me. But essentially, what it is taking those forms of language, the relation between subject and object, and looking at them in a linguistic way. And that's possible because in what Hegel calls science, the word subject, Subjekt in German, means both the individual subject, the self, but it also means the grammatical subject.
Wow.
So in the preface to the Phenomenology, there are these few incredibly dense pages called, usually referred to as the speculative sentence section, where Hegel talks about how we should look at grammatical structure in a new way. We should look, and he admits, he says, nobody understands how I'm writing here, what I'm saying, because they don't understand the grammatical form I'm using. What it is looking at this grammatical structure, the fundamental structure between subject and object, or between subject and predicate, right? Between, what is it? Every proposition has a subject and a predicate. Iron is a metal. Okay, metal is the predicate. So Hegel invites us to look at this not just as the subject kind of positing its meaning in the predicate, but to look at the predicate as then being filled with meaning, rebounding, and speaking back to the subject. I know this is incredible.
It's really
it seems it's
wow.
so. What he's saying is that in his philosophy there is a kind of fluid ambiguity between subject and predicate, where we have to look at. Well, you could use the example of the master-slave dialectic, where it is the master who initially determines the slave's body. It's kind of a feature of slavery in general. Hegel says, okay, if we look at this grammatically, we see that the master, if we take him as a grammatical subject, taking the slave as its predicate, then we have to also look at that predicate as once filled with meaning and subjectivity that has been posited in it, as actually speaking back, as having a life and a discourse of its own. So I find looking at the master-slave dialectic very helpful, because you look at subjugated or dominated peoples, for example, are often predicated by subjects, slaves, and for slaves you can write in whatever you want, women, gays, people of color, whatever, dominated people. They, the discourse always runs one way. They are this, they are that. Women are naturally disposed to having babies. They are more natural than men. They are emotional. They are communal. They're not, you just have to look at Jordan Peterson video and you'll see everything about that. Anyway, so what Hegel is saying is that in the master-slave dialectic, the slave then speaks back. The slave then says, no, I am this, I am that. And not only that, what the slave does is then predicate who was the master before, right? The master becomes the predicate. So who was the master before? Okay, let's say it was me, white man, that's good enough, white man, okay? Okay, all right. What does it mean for me to become the predicate? That means that, I have to think of myself as cisgendered, for example. I have to think of myself as heterosexual, cisgendered. I have to think of myself perhaps as, being part of a colonizing, dominating culture. Do I like this? Well, not immediately. I don't like being predicated, especially when that's not the meaning I started out with. But if you just looking at the master-slave dialectic as an example of what I'm talking about, you can see how the linguistic reading can sort of open up that form of consciousness, and we can see actual forms of language that accompany the form of consciousness. So I try to do that throughout the book. We could look at sense certainty, which is just that naive consciousness that what's out there is out there and it comes to me and I process it. You can look at that in terms of maybe big data or data language, or the reduction of all reality to zeros and ones of raw data, and think of ourselves as just data processors. That's, to me, a very impoverished way of looking at our interaction with the world. But we could look at different forms of language that arise from that relationship. So that's what I'm trying to do. And that's why it's hermeneutical openness, because when you allow the predicate to talk back, the space between subject and predicate opens up to meaning. And I know hermeneutical, what does it mean? It just means interpretation of meaning. Okay, so we open up different ways of interpreting. I think that's the outcome. That's my desire, anyway.
It's really interesting. I have a question. When you talk about different kinds of, I think you talked about discourses, or what do you mean by that? Because you said, for example, there's an impoverished way of seeing the world, right? But there's consequently a richer way. But why is there some kind of degree of communication?
Well, I think the degree is it accompanies what I was saying about forms of consciousness. Forms of language that are richer are ones that allow for differences of interpretation. The opposite of that is dogmatic thought, which just simply maintains the fiction, we could say, and the form of discourse. We're talking about discourse. Dogmatic discourse says, this is the way it is. My word is the law. It is this way, and that's the way it is. And it's no other way. So that form of discourse, which is omnipresent, of course, and in today's society, of course, an online society, we could say that's virtually all that discourse is. There's very little argument. There's very little openness. It's, you're this, you're that, you're wrong, I'm right, this is the way, this is the truth. So we could say that is the world that is, you have to have, I think, a performative idea of language. If I'm talking about language as actually taking place in the world, that it's important to think of language as actually constituting the world that we live in. We live in different language worlds. And so I would say a world that is brought about by an impoverished type of dogmatic discourse, a Twitterverse, for example, is an impoverished reality. Compared to what? Well, compared to, for example, a university setting where students and professors are discussing interpretation openly, or a parliament where, a functional parliament, where politicians are actually debating ideas and what's best for the country, or a Congress, or whatever. So I guess that performative idea is important.
And I'm curious because when you say, I understand the general idea of what you're saying, but what, like, I'm thinking about Hegel, and why is the result of a richer conversation better? How can you explain that?
How is it better? I don't think for Hegel it's a normative. It's a normative fact, or a normative proposition that if we do this, we will be better. I think Hegel always starts from an end position and looks back to see how we got there. And with Hegel's end position, because his end position is Hegelian science, that's pretty good. It is where we're going. And what is Hegelian science? To me, it is philosophical science that is systematic and that takes place in the framework of a public university. To me, that's very important to recognize the status of the public university. When I say public, I mean state university, which was fairly new at Hegel's time. The University of Berlin had just been formed in 1810. It was already in the works when Hegel's writing the Phenomenology, I suppose. But the idea is, if we start from there, if we start from this idea of a space where philosophy of religion, philosophy of art, philosophy of philosophy, philosophy of nature, where these elements actually take place, then how did we get there? Let's look back at the forms of consciousness. So those forms of consciousness can be partly historical, right? Because hermeneutics is a form of freedom and freedom of interpretation. How did we get there? What's the story that brought us there? So it's not so much that, we could say that if the goal is self-knowledge, then that is a good, perhaps. And we end the end of the Hegelian system is the three great ideas: the idea of truth, the idea of the good, and the idea of the beautiful. If that's if we accept those objects as the objects of philosophy, the objects of human striving, then to arrive not at, a sort of definition of the good, but if we can arrive at a place and a space where the good is discussed and animated in an animated way in the university in a philosophical way, well, then we've kind of arrived at something that has been the goal of philosophy. And we could say that for Hegel, I guess if we take philosophy as the love of wisdom, science, what he calls science, is the system of the Hegelian system of philosophy, which you find in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. We could say that is wisdom. So we kind of go beyond love of wisdom. Love of wisdom has become wisdom. That doesn't mean that the world is suddenly transformed and everything is rosy. It just simply means for Hegel that we've arrived at a point where the truth of our kind of dialogical philosophical beings is, I could even use the term celebrated in an actual political space called the university. And Hegel's idea also is that the mission of the university is to form civil servants, citizens, so that if there is an idea of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the free, then that can also then participate in the actual life of the state through education. Hegel spent his whole life, his whole professional life, as an educator, as a professor. So, and he really believed in it. That idea that you find in Rousseau, that the mission of the philosopher is to educate humanity. We have to do that through different institutions for Hegel, like the university.
And from what I understand, there seems I call it the richer version in the university. There seems, and if I try to link it what you said before between about the relationship between the subject and the predicate, to me it seems that in the university, we suppose that the relationship is open, like you said. We are able to go from the subject to the predicate and the predicate to the subject. But in the dogmatic way, there's only the subject to the predicate. The predicate doesn't come back.
That's right. Okay. And that's, I think, we could say the point of university study is to counter dogmatic discourse. Now, you could say, well, but Hegel's a professor. He's up there on his podium, professing his thought. You could say that he's not really enacting what he's not really practicing what he's preaching. But I think what he is doing is an apprenticeship in the student, an apprenticeship that allows the student to then become subjective, to become a predicate. And Hegel's own teaching to overcome their status as a predicate and actually speak out, I guess. And to interpret things, to always interpret text and never take it simply as dogmatic truth. But Hegel's own style of teaching apparently was, you could say it was almost dialogical. I mean, he was always famously stopping, stuttering, starting again. And he had this accent, a Schwabian accent, which for people in Berlin was kind of like, from the provinces. And, it was listening to him, you had the impression apparently that, or to me, it seems, of someone dialoguing with themselves. Someone constantly saying, well, that's not quite right. Maybe I should say it this way. Okay, that'll do for now. But you know what I mean? So just actively working things out.
And what you just mentioned, I think it's really interesting that you have to, from what I understood, it seems that you have to learn there's a learning curve before you can speak up.
Yeah, I think there is. With Hegel's pedagogy, he emphasizes, because he wrote reports for the high schools as well, for the Minister of Education, and his idea was that first you had to gain a lot of knowledge, and to do that it was just by habit, repetition, memorization, just drudgery. But then having acquired a certain body of culture, then you had to do an apprenticeship in contradiction, like Zeno's paradoxes, or Kant's dialectic of reason. And this was to enable the student to then be able to question and overturn and kind of dilute all the hard knowledge that they'd learned and make it fluid and active. Mm-hmm. So you could look at that as a kind of apprenticeship to, sort of taking control, taking that content that has been predicated into me and making it something that now I can speak about. I can now become the subject. And then, Hegel says, then you're ready for the university. Mm-hmm. He taught at a high school for 9 years, tried to teach his own philosophy at a high school and said, forget it. Nobody understands me. It's completely frustrating. It's not the place to do that. Mm-hmm. Okay, but the high school is a place to sort of get knowledge and then question it before you leave.
Mm-hmm. And I had a question. When we studied, you mentioned the Zeno, I'm thinking about the Parménide, the dialogue, the Platonic dialogue.
That's another one Hegel mentions, so that's a great example. Yeah, drive you crazy. Exactly.
I still don't understand it, but because the professor who taught us, he mentioned that it was like a central issue for Hegel, that dialogue. I don't know if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Well, just because it's an active, it's a perfect example of dialectical thought, and dialectical thought is just the restlessness, the negation, the overturning of thought itself. You need more than that. You also need content, but in terms of just looking at an expression of dialectical thought, dialectical thought that contradicts itself, that fluidifies. What it is not, then that's how he uses the Parmenide as a great example of that you can already find in Plato. Of course, you can find in Socratic dialogue as well. You find great examples of overturning. I have I wrote an article about it, and I think it's kind of an important aspect of Hegel. That you find in his philosophy of nature, and I use it as an example because Hegel himself says, if you want to find out what I mean by dialectic, we can look at my view of the solar system. And his view of the solar system, you've got the sun, which is the in itself, sort of we could say thought in itself. We have then, says, lunar objects, moons. And moons, why are they important? Because they are simply orbital bodies. They obey a kind of predictable logic, and they turn around other bodies. It's an important moment, but if we just stop there, you have sort of a mechanistic way of looking at everything. You have to have the introduction of another body, another heavenly body, which Hegel assigns to comets. It says comets are these bodies of fire and fluidity that come into the solar system and dilute sort of that hard mechanistic aspect of the system. They are instances of, we could say, dialectic negativity. So thought is this restless, negating dialectic in the sense of always overturning, always questioning, always troubling, and diluting what is presented as immediately lunar. Lunar, what's one-faced? The moon only turns one face to us. Mm-hmm. It's hard. There's no water on it. It's crystalline. So if you sort of transform that into a type of dogmatic thought, again, you have that thought that says, this is the way it is, and I'm not changing. Mm-hmm. But if you introduce sort of that cometary aspect that is in thought itself, then we can have a system that is actually organic in Hegel's sense. In other words, moving and alive.
But that's when you talked about the linguistic aspect, well, the subject predicate. Mm-hmm. And what you seem to be talking about right now is like this idea of creativity, or we bring in something. Mm-hmm. But how can you explain that in the linguistic way?
Well, I think that's, if you look at what is actually going on in the predication, sort of just have to get into a little more detail here. Predication Hegel's philosophy of language makes the distinction between linguistic signs and words. Oh. And it's not always clear, but a linguistic sign is something that is just a naturally formed, we could say, lunar piece of moon rock. What do I mean by that? I mean, a linguistic sign is just if the word dog, I'm saying the word dog, okay, which has a significance and a meaning, takes place in the linguistic sign DOG. Mm-hmm. The linguistic sign for that in French is CHIEN, mm-hmm. right? So what language does is it takes linguistic signs that are already there. Okay, they're there in our culture, mm-hmm. in our language, and it invests them with thought, and that thought sort of inhabits the sign and turns it into a word. So a word is a sign that has been filled with thought. Mm-hmm. But thought is an expression of negativity. It's, we could say, dialectical. It is cometary. So what I'm doing when I'm forming words is overcoming the kind of just static nature of the sign and turning it into a word that is filled with meaning. But that meaning or that thought only inhabits that sign for a time.
Wow.
Okay, it is kind of the end of the sign. It puts the sign to death in it becoming a word. And I know this is, you really have to read the preface to my book. It took me a long time to kind of, try to articulate this, but that's what the vanishing words are. To me, vanishing words are a condition for meaning. It is when words are allowed to vanish. And by vanish, I just mean that the hard linguistic sign or signifier is overcome to become something else. Mm-hmm. And that meaning inhabits the word only for a moment. It's, on a more down-to-earth, here we are speaking. I say a word to you. The word, it transmits, and it's also going through microphones and things, but it's there. Mm-hmm. But it's not there. Mm-hmm. It's understood. You grasp it, but you grasp it as it disappears. The meaning appears as the word evaporates in a way. Mm-hmm. Dogmatic discourse does not accept the vanishing of words. It says that my word is the law. It is, the expression, what I say is written in stone. Mm-hmm. That says it all. It's written in stone means that it will never vanish. The meaning is there as I put it there. It will never leave that linguistic sign. So I guess that's another element that I think is fundamental to this equation or this way of looking at forms of consciousness and language in that way as hermeneutical. Because by saying that my words are vanishing, I'm allowing interpretation mm-hmm. to take place.
And I have a last question. I don't want to take too much of your time, but that's because all we're saying from the beginning, all you're saying.
No, it's a dialogue. You're asking the questions.
It is. But what you're explaining, what you explain through what seems that you're explaining through your book, is that there is this language can be a way, and I don't think Hegel. You seem pretty clear that Hegel is not making any normative statement, but language seems to be the way that we can say, like, have free speech, dialogue, and be able to change things. But my worry is that, isn't it the same way to say, there's a song, I don't remember who, but it says, like, it goes like, if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for anything, something like that. And it seems like, how can you not fall into relativism?
Yeah,
right.
Sure. No, that's an important point. Again, and we're talking about Hegel, so I'll defer to Hegel. Again, it is the end point that explains and in a way justifies the movement up to that point. So if you take politically, for example, within Hegel's system of science, the political, or what he calls objective spirit, is a form of political body that is itself an organic system that is made up not just of individuals, but of different institutions, different particular institutions. For example, the family, tradition, but also courts of law, parliaments, business, corporations, churches, the Constitution, Supreme Court. All of those organs are what makes up the alive, fully functioning body politic, in which the individual citizen is able to recognize her freedom in the institutions. Okay, so this is a scientific vision of what we could say an ideal scientific body politic would look like. So if we take that idea, that's a very definite idea that is sort of derived from Hegel's philosophy, that is kind of an endpoint within his system of science, that idea. Now that is very, Marx criticized it as being purely bourgeois, capitalist. People still do, say it's actually very much like Canadian democracy, in fact. But however we take it, it's not a relativistic idea. It's a very pronounced idea that is opposed to certain notions of pure individualism or populism. For example, Hegel's notion of the organic state stands opposed to Trumpian populism or whatever other form of populism, which always takes place with the dissolution. It always aims at the dissolution of institutions. Right? That's the first thing populism does, is say, you can't trust the courts, you can't trust politicians, you can't trust the FBI, you can't trust, all these institutions are just BS. It's the people. The people are you and me. We're all individuals here. Okay, it's BS, of course, but whatever. So Hegel's system definitely stands against and opposed to that notion. Just as an example. So, there is a dialectic, but the dialectic has an end point. And that's essentially also the distinction you may have heard between left Hegelians and right Hegelians, between young Hegelians and old Hegelians. Traditionally, that just meant that the young Hegelians, who were also the left Hegelians, Marx, Engels, Feuerbach, Max Stirner, all of those were people who love the dialectic because it's revolutionary, but forget the system, right? We don't want to go there, right? The system, if the system is the system of the status quo, then no, right? So that doesn't mean I'm a right Hegelian, you can probably tell by my discourse, but I definitely recognize the importance of, we could say the narrative importance of systematicity for Hegel. In order to really understand what he's talking about, you have to take seriously the aspiration, the systematic aspiration that he has, I think. And in the book, I use examples. I mean, if you take a great work of literature, I particularly like Jane Austen. You take a Jane Austen novel, you know, it's filled with these little details that, you know, so-and-so catches a cold, has to stay home in bed, or somebody goes to a ball, they feel that they've been insulted, whatever. They make no sense at all, except in terms of the whole narrative. And then you look back and you say, I see why it was important that Catherine got a cold or whatever. Then she could meet so-and-so and whatever, you know. So I think there's, talking about language, I think there is a narrative aspect to the system that's important, that confers sense on all the elements in terms of that final kind of articulation. Even though, just one last, I don't know if it's the last word, but I really believe that Hegel's system is an open system. It's, if you take it seriously as an organic system, which I do, then as any organism, it is always open to new content. And, you know, so I think it's, in Hegel's view, it's a system that is meant to be alive. If we take that seriously, then it's a system that should be open to new content. And so it's not closed in the sense of, you know, hermetically. It's hermeneutically open, not hermetically sealed. I could say that.
Well, thanks a lot. It's really interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I want to end it here so it's not too long. But thank you so much again for coming on. Do you have any events or anything that you want to talk about?
No, not really. I would just like to say that, you know, we're returning, you know, slowly to in-person teaching. I have one in-person graduate seminar with 10 people in it, so we can do it in person. And I also have a what they call bimodal, so it's part online, part in person. And I would just like to say, if students are listening, you know, to really exert pressure, I would say, on the administration to go back to in-person teaching. You know, unless you're happy sitting at home looking at a black screen, but if you want to get back, it's not a bad thing to contact someone in the administration and encourage them to try to reopen and come back to the live university. Yeah. So that's my last word. So the event is just these days just teaching live, which is an event in itself. Great. Perfect. Well, thank you a lot, Professor Reid, and I hope we can talk again. All right. Yeah, it's a pleasure.